I'm glad you came out. Beautiful, airport area in North Charleston. I'm glad to have you here. There's more people. I was thinking about this last night, and I was like worried there'd be like one guy here, and it would be like kind of weird. So there's already more people here than I feared would attend. So I'm glad you're here. Obviously, you're here for Guns in America. All right, that sounds like the name of a mini series on some channel, but Guns in America. And what that means and the regulation and the Second Amendment and how they impact our society. So Guns in America, introduction to the Second Amendment. And I was doing research on this, and I realized that this is, this is kind of tough research. Guns in America is tough research because we all get our stuff online, right? And since we get our stuff online, we have to think who is writing these articles? Who is like going home after like a hard day's work and writing an article about the Second Amendment for fun where they're not getting paid? So I realized that, there is a very small bit of credible information out there online because the guys who watch InfoWars videos constantly all day and the guys who write Second Amendment articles for fun, there's a big overlap there. So you want to get some true information, and you'll see throughout the presentation there's some not true information out there. So you got to really weed out, I think the buzzword of 2017 that's already lost its luster is fake news, right? That was a cool thing to say like 3 months ago, and now everything you don't agree with is fake news. But there is a lot of, I'll call it disinformation out there about the Second Amendment. If you want to find a quote by the Founding Fathers, you could find it. You could say you could find Thomas Jefferson saying that Twitter is better than Facebook, and you look that up on the internet and you'll find it. So it's hard to find real credible information about the Second Amendment and especially about guns out there because everybody is given a microphone and an opinion, including me now, and no matter what their opinion is, they get an equal voice of it. So you might wonder, who is, not the brightest projector. Who am I? Who's this guy here? That's me right there. That's my dad. He's a cool guy. So a little bit about me. I have a bio page on there somewhere, but I always want to say this. I'm a former grocery bagger. Everyone always talks about their first job out of law school. I'll just talk about my first job in general. Former grocery bagger at Winn-Dixie. That was fun. In college, I was a delivery driver for Sammy's Deli in Columbia. That was, it was fun times, worked for my friend's business. And through my experiences as a delivery driver, my vast training and experience, I became an armed robbery victim. All right. And now I'm not one of those jaded guys who was a victim of a crime once. Not there's anything wrong with that, but victim of a crime and is going on a crusade to nothing personal. They wanted my money more than I did apparently because they had guns and I didn't. So I was robbed in Columbia, South Carolina by two guys with guns. All right. And again, that doesn't really change my worldview. It's just an understanding of how powerful these devices are. They're powerful enough for me to give them my wallet and say, please just go away. I'm also a gun owner. I think two guns, probably. Not like a vast cache of weapons, but I do own two guns. And I enjoy guns, all right? I like shooting guns. But I also, when I hold a gun in my hand and I feel that weight, and I look at each single bullet and I think of what that bullet that cost 40 cents is capable of doing. You hold it and you have to have respect and knowledge of what's in your hand, capable of changing, lives and really ending lives. My first job out of law school, here's where I should have started. I was a public defender in Sumter County. A lot of public defenders in the bigger areas, they're like, congrats on being a public defender. Here's 4 cases and 3 of them are speeding. Good luck. Let us know how you do on those. Sumter County is great. It's a great area. My first day, they're like, hey, Grant, how you doing? Here's Bob, and there's Jill, and here's your filing cabinet. And there's 340 cases in there, and half of them are probably attempted murder. So I really was given a great chance, maybe probably shouldn't have been given that great chance, but I was given a great chance to learn how things work, learn the hard way. And I did. I've tried, I don't even know how many cases. I'm not not like 8,000 or anything like that, but I've tried a lot of cases, and it seems like just about all of them involve guns. If there's not guns, there's drugs, and there's usually both. Even if you don't realize there's both, if you trace the link long enough, they all link back to either guns or drugs, just about. I was a ASOL, as the defense bar calls them, assistant solicitor. I prosecuted in Spartanburg County. Again, pretty much everything had to do with guns or drugs, but I prosecuted there for about a year. That was interesting. And now I'm a solo attorney. I do almost exclusively criminal defense work because it's what I want to do and it's what I like doing. And it's never a dull day. So that's me, just in case, I don't like to talk about myself too much, but so you know that, who I am, not just some, homeless guy they paid $8 off the street. So that's me. Yeah. Where's the thing? Now, hold on. It's not clicking. There we go. So you know who I am. What am I talking about? I'm talking about guns, obviously. This is a little blurry. But no one uses a dictionary anymore, so the Google definition of a gun is a weapon incorporating a metal tube from which bullets, shells, or other missiles, as in the projectiles, are propelled by an explosive force, typically making a characteristic loud, sharp noise. I thought it was interesting that they included the noise that a gun makes in the definition, but yeah. In South Carolina 23-31-10, it doesn't really give a definition of firearms as a whole, interesting, or guns as a whole. Instead, it gives a definition of each type of gun. So, it'll say, what is a handgun? A barrel, it has to have a barrel length of less than, I can't even remember how many inches. What is a shotgun? What is a rifle? Interestingly, there's almost no restrictions in South Carolina about antique firearms. You could pretty much, ride around with like a dual gun, like Alexander Hamilton, whatever. You could ride around with a dual gun and legally do whatever you want. You might get some bad looks. You might get arrested just for being weird, but technically there's not a lot of restrictions on what they consider an antique firearm. And generally the barometer of what qualifies as an antique firearm is if it uses black powder. Black powder is like the old school stuff in muskets where there's like a giant trail of smoke when you fire it. And smokeless powder is what all modern firearms use. And someone else will tell you the chemical makeup of that because I don't really. Something about nitrate, I think, is what qualifies it as smokeless powder. Yeah, and here's a quote. All a gun does is focus an explosion in one direction. That is a very, minimalist quote from every 19-year-old male's favorite movie that they really identify with, of course, Fight Club, or the book Fight Club. So that's a broad term of firearms. Since we have guns, they came from somewhere, obviously. And the history of firearms is, you could really parallel the history of firearms to the history of generally civilization itself and borders and war and the modern era. In fact, one of the first battles that they used cannons was the fall of Constantinople, and that is generally considered to be the beginning of the modern era. So in a way, firearms are really tied to our development as a species, really. The first gun that we know of, or the first thing that predated guns, was the Chinese fire lance. It was basically like a weird flamethrower at the end of a bamboo stick, and they would ride on horses, and they would light the black powder, and it would kind of shoot off some fire and smoke at the enemy. And that was, certainly a relatively efficient projectile, not too great, but better than everything else they had. And but a lot of what it accomplished was, scaring the hell out of the other side, because they're shooting, imagine if you've never seen a gun, never seen an explosion, never seen a cannon. The other side is riding around on horses shooting fire at you. That would, generally scare your opposition. So that's where guns came from. And they eventually developed into the hand cannon. Now, there's a term out there, hand cannon, kind of any big handgun, right? We call it hand cannon. I think they said something about that in Pulp Fiction. But for historical purposes, a hand cannon is what replaced the Chinese fire lance. It It was about that big, about like I think it was about 18 inches long, kind of like a giant pistol, no grooves, no rifling, and it would shoot one projectile, and you hold it on your back and then use it, and it was really heavy. And I think they were made out of like some kind of stone, so it wasn't the most efficient thing in the world, and you have to manually light it. But the oldest known firearm is a hand cannon. The oldest known firearm that we still have is a hand cannon, and it was found in the 70s by some guys in China that were probably building a parking lot or something, and they find this ancient relic that we think is from 1288, and we even know what some of the details about where it was used, why it was used, what battle it was used in. So that's pretty cool. So 1288 is generally where the beginning of firearms that shoot projectiles comes from, because the Chinese fire lance just shot off the powder. We're not sure when, but eventually gunpowder came its way to Europe by the Silk Road. And gunpowder is basically the technology that allowed guns to happen, right? It's easy to make a tube, easy to make a thing that shoots out of the tube. Gunpowder is the most important factor. It's the ingredient that we needed to make these weapons. So that came to Europe via the Silk Road at some point, and then Europe got a hold of the gunpowder and started making guns. They had hand cannons, and they finally had the predecessor to the musket was the arquebus. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The arquebus, and that was a bigger, heavier musket, and it had I believe it was a flintlock. So it was tougher to fire than a musket. And then the musket replaced that, and that's kind of what we know of when we think of an old gun, right? We got the musket. You got guys in the French and Indian War firing muskets, all this stuff. What made the musket more efficient and what accomplished the transition to modern guns is two things. Rifling, and in case you don't know, the old thing you use is the football and the spiral, right? You throw a football without a spiral and it's inaccurate. You throw a football with a spiral and it goes in one direction. And that's what rifling is. It twists the bullet in the barrel. If you look down a barrel, which you shouldn't do, you'll see grooves in the barrel. That twists the bullet so its energy is spent twisting and not wobbling around into space. That made guns significantly more accurate, because before, whatever direction the musket, whatever piece of the barrel the musket touched last, it would spin that way. So whatever it happened to touch last, it would spin that way, and whatever direction it spun, it would go off in that direction. So if you've ever fired a paintball gun, you know how inaccurate they can be, and that's what muskets were. Picture a paintball gun, except every paintball can kill somebody, and now you know the importance of rifling. It's smokeless powder, like I talked about earlier. That's important. It developed the self-propelled cartridge or self-contained cartridge, and it made guns a lot more efficient, and you didn't have to clean them all the time. Black powder is very caustic. So those are the two developments that made firearms what they are today. And after those developments, it kind of just, we went from old rifles to AR-15s and stuff like that. So that's, what did I do? All right, so America traces most of its roots to England, right? We seceded from England, we rebelled from England. That's where a lot of the colonists came from. So the history of guns in England is important to be able to tell the history of guns in America. Guns in England were never constitutionally protected when they came around. But why would they be, right? They're just like, it's the 1600s or the 1500s. It's just property. We didn't really think to constitutionally protect them because they were already around. So they didn't have any constitutional protections. And then in 1689, England had the Bill of Rights, what they call the Bill of Rights of 1689. And it had all these rights. One of the rights buried in there was the right to own firearms if you're Protestant. So let's not get too crazy with the Catholic people running around with guns, but if you're Protestant, that's fine. So that's interesting. And if you read the Bill of Rights of 1689, most of the other rights are just for everybody. So it's not that the Bill of Rights of 1689 only applied to Protestants. It's that it's specifically in that provision included for Protestants. Let's not get too crazy. And also in England, the first gun control act that they had was in 1920. And that was significantly after the United States spun off or whatever, rebelled. So that was an afterthought. But 1920 is when they really started to regulate guns. And we all know now that it's pretty much impossible to get a gun in Europe, especially a handgun. So we know that led to increased regulation. And here's the exact wording of the Bill of Rights of 1689. In case you can't read it, it just says that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and is allowed by law. And this is some historical piece of that Bill of Rights. And in England, you had the people there, and obviously a lot of them came here, and we trace a lot of our history to England. So early North America, that was a little different than England because we had to settle it. We didn't arrive in Manhattan with skyscrapers already there. We had to make the skyscrapers. So we're frontier folk at first. We had to survive. Part of the survival was hunting, fur trapping. Part of the survival was other people trying to survive. They're trying to survive by taking your stuff. So you need a gun too. So guns were pretty important and ingrained in our identity as frontier folks, for those of us that, were frontier folks. Clashes with Native Americans. We came here and it was their land. And they're like, buddy, what are you doing? And we had guns and they didn't. And that, like it or not, forged our early national identity. Obviously, we had early wars, early skirmishes here, the French and Indian War, wars in Florida, battles in Florida between the Spanish and the English. Like I said, Native Americans. Every single war in the United States, or what later became the United States, used guns. And that was a first because back in Europe, they have an older history. They're using lances. So part of our national identity is every single war that was fought here was fought with a firearm. And that, of course, that national identity, that frontier mentality, that survival mentality, that need to survive, that led to our fierce independence. And that independence was culminated in the American Revolution. And of course, that was fought with guns against other people with guns. And just an example of a colony in Massachusetts where a lot of this stuff went down with the American Revolution. Obviously, all the settlers there, just about all the settlers there had guns. A gun back then is like having a hammer today. It's a tool. It's a tool to survive. It's a tool to eat. It's a tool to protect your family. And that's what it was used for. In 1630, they passed a law in Massachusetts that all adult men must be armed. So that's kind of like a ultra Second Amendment, right? All adult men must be armed. If you aren't armed, we're going to write you some, stupid ticket like they, do today if you are armed. And they also passed the law, all male youth from 10 to 16 must be trained and instructed in the exercise of firearms. Now think about how those two go together. You got a bunch of guys who must be armed. Well, it's pretty important to say that because they must be armed, let's teach them, you shoot that way, or you pull the trigger, or maybe you don't look down the barrel like I told you to do earlier. So we have people that are all armed, but all instructed in how to be armed and how to properly do that. Important to note that early Massachusetts, this was mainly done by municipalities, but it was against the law, punishable by a severe imprisonment, to sell a gun to a Native American. So we had the guns and we didn't want that power trickling down to people who we didn't want power. And that kind of ties in with our early colonial existence, and it ties in with the American Revolution because we had guns, we were able to fight off England and win our independence. We didn't want them doing that same thing back to us. So we outlawed the sale of guns to Native Americans in Massachusetts. One example, there was a woman tried in 1640. She went to trial for selling a gun to a Native American. And her defense was, it's a good defense, and it reminded me of what I do now. She didn't sell it to him. She let him borrow it after her husband died. So the judge said, well, miss, go home and get it back from him because I don't want him having the gun. So it turned out all right for her. But that's just an example of how we wanted to retain control of guns. Like I said earlier, there's so much information about guns. A lot of people write articles on guns. And one quote is from the Federalist Papers. You'll see this a lot on the internet. The best thing we can hope for, or the best we can hope for concerning the people at large, is that they be properly armed. We want a well-armed militia. We want civilians to be armed. We want them to be able to rise against their government. And online, you'll see everyone talking about this. And that's a very clear example of what they wanted, what the founding fathers wanted, and how it's being twisted around today. Unfortunately, you can't read that, but that quote's fake. I saw that quote everywhere. I tried to research it. Someone just made that up, and it's spread everywhere. So be careful about where you get your information from. That quote is part of a large paragraph, and it kind of try to sum up that paragraph into one sentence, and that's really not at all what he's saying. So it's easy to find people that agree with you if that's where you start from on your research. If you start your research with a premise and a conclusion, you're basically doing the scientific method backwards. You're going to be able to find people to agree with you, especially on the internet. Not saying that's a bad quote or a bad thing, or not saying I personally disagree with that or agree with it. I'm just saying that be careful where you get your stuff from. Obviously, the American Revolution was fought and won using firearms. Our early colonial identity was from, in large part, our self-reliance with firearms. And so we established the Second Amendment in the Constitution. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And stated here, there's complexity in its brevity, right? There's kind of wish we could go back and say, hey man, maybe write a couple more paragraphs. Maybe, what you mean? Come on. Like, it's literally one sentence. I mean, you got some clauses in there, but it's one sentence. And I'm here today, 231, I think, no, with Constitution, 220 years later, just about, talking about this one sentence. And you wonder, would I be here talking about it if there were another few sentences? Would we have had a consensus? That's what we got, and that's why I'm here, the one sentence. See, there's complexity to its brevity, there's beauty to its brevity, and there's a little bit of scariness to its brevity, because this is a big deal, and it's become a big deal. In the Second Amendment, when they were talking about it, there was a debate at the convention. Because the roles of the militia, which it mentions a well-regulated militia, the militia was originally, every state had a militia. There was no federal militia. Every state had a militia, and that was established in the Articles of Confederation. So it was, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, almost kind of how the National Guard is today. Every state had a militia, and it was controversial that the Constitution said a well-regulated militia, but not well-regulated state militias, one militia, or one group of militia. So there was some controversy in that, but it's all in context, because the Articles of Confederation were basically created to be an anti-England. It was like everything they did, that kind of sucks, so we're not going to do that at all. That was basically a really bastardized version of what, how I described the Articles of Confederation. It was about establishing a weak federal state, and it was about basically surviving as a nation. After a few years, we said, hey, this thing's not, things not working out too great. We don't know what the hell we're doing. How about we have a little more regulation? We're not going to be England, but let's keep in mind, England's been around for like 1 billion years, so they're doing something kind of right. They didn't treat us great, but let's be a little more like England, but not without all the crazy, basically authoritarianness. So that's why we established the Constitution, as you know. The original drafts of the Constitution had one more sentence in there in the Second Amendment. And that was, after all that stuff, the end said, but no person religiously scrupulous shall be compelled to bear arms. So it was a conscious objector clause was established in the Second Amendment at first, but they struck that. So it's kind of neat to know the history of the Second Amendment, how it started, where it got. It was pretty much always identical except for that one clause, though. The intent of the Second Amendment is pretty clear, especially in the 1700s. Designed to protect against tyranny, right? And I think that's where a lot of the super InfoWars Second Amendment type guys, they talk about that. It was designed to protect against tyranny. It was designed so everyone can rebel against the government. That's what it was originally designed for. Whether or not that carries through to 2017, that's certainly up for debate. But Jefferson's personal motto and his seal was rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Now, Jefferson didn't write the Second Amendment, but he hung out with those guys. So that's, interesting to know. Several Supreme Court cases, and the other presenters will talk more about the role of the Supreme Court, the role of regulation, all that stuff. I don't want to infringe upon them. But early Supreme Court cases on the Second Amendment clarified that the Second Amendment only clarified an existing right. That's words from the Supreme Court. So we had this right to, their thought is, we had this right to own guns. The Second Amendment cleared it up. And a lot of people would say that's what the Bill of Rights is, the entirety of the Bill of Rights is. They didn't give them rights. They don't give us rights. It only clarified the rights that we already had. Federalist Paper number 46 talks about the right to own arms, the right to bear arms. It talks about what the appropriate size of the militia is. It talks about the role of the militia. It talks about defending ourselves from tyrants. It also talks about what happens if we're the tyrants. And it's very aware of that. I hadn't looked much into the Federalist Papers until recently, and I was kind of amazed when I read this because it talks about the necessity of having a small army. It doesn't talk about we need more guns, we need fancier stuff, we need better missiles. I know that wasn't around then. But it talks about the necessity of having a small army so it doesn't turn against its citizens. It kind of weighs the pros and cons. It says citizens with guns is good because it can be a check on the militia. So we feared martial law and the militia back then, but we knew we needed to have it because other folks don't like us sometimes. So citizens with guns is good because it was a check on the militia. Militia with guns can be dangerous. They can go rogue. They can turn on the citizens. And that's kind of how it flies in the face of how at least I and a lot of people normally interpret the Second Amendment. What you think of the Second Amendment is guns are good. We need a militia. It establishes basically the army, although that was done in the actual body of the Constitution. But it flies in the face of how we normally interpret the Second Amendment, or at least I do. Guns can be bad in the powerful's hands. Guns are better in the weak's hands. And that was Federalist Paper number 46. Alexander Hamilton wrote that one. I think the three writers, there's 70-something Federalist Papers. There's between like 70 and 100 Federalist Papers. I'm not sure the exact amount. Alexander Hamilton wrote most of them. I think James Madison wrote a lot of them. And then John Jay wrote like 3 of them. And he gets credit for writing, the Federalist Papers. Kind of like Ringo Starr of the Federalist Papers. Like he occasionally pops in there. But it was mainly Alexander Hamilton. And that's what he thought about it. So, where are guns today? What is the role of guns today? This is supposed to be formatted better. But I've read a book recently by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's called Between the World and Me. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to check it out. It's about race relations in the United States, about police brutality, and it's framed as a series of letters to his son about what it's like to grow up as a minority in the United States. And the quote he says somewhere in there is, this is part of a larger sentence, and the dreamers are quoting Martin Luther King and exalting nonviolence for the weak and the biggest guns for the strong. And this is kind of ties into the previous slides about who should get the guns, who has the guns. Do we all need guns? People out there saying, the powerful people are talking about how great nonviolence is, and also asking the Mount Pleasant Police Department to ride around in a tank. So you wonder what Alexander Hamilton would think about Mount Pleasant having a tank and everyone else not being allowed to have a gun. And right, so the concept of big guns for the strong, nonviolence for the weak. Kind of exactly what the Second Amendment was designed to prevent. Designed to prevent guys with AR-15s arresting people, and then everyone else with no power to check on that. Now, it's important to know, I'm just talking about the 1700s and how it translates today. I don't know what that would look like today, right? I don't know what us resisting the government would look like today. I'm not some anti-government nut that has a bunker. I'm not advocating that we all get AR-15s. I think a lot of things have changed since 1781, 1776, 1789. I think a lot of things have changed since then. But the Second Amendment, the text hasn't. So take from that what you will. It's important to remember that until modern times, until recently, guns were the most, and even now they kind of are, but less so, guns were the most effective weapon. Guns were like, it was basically like mutually assured destruction in your pocket. And I think a lot of that went into the framing of the Second Amendment. They didn't have smart missiles. You didn't have, anti-riot gear. When you were fighting a war or a revolution, you had a gun, which is the exact same weapon the other guy had. It was like a check on power in your pocket. So because of that check on power in your pocket, it prevented tyranny. Their words were that it prevented tyranny from any kind of oppressive government regime, as well as safety in your home, and as well as all the other stuff we're talking about, the fur trapping, the hunting, all that stuff. It's a tool. And so now here we are today in 2017 with the Second Amendment written in 1781, 1789. And the earliest gun laws, what was the earliest gun control law that I talked about? Illegal to give a Native American or slaves a gun. In the Dred Scott decision, they set up this hypothetical statement as a cautionary tale. It says, imagine, as you know, Dred Scott was to say, a black person has no standing in federal court to sue. That's basically what the entire Dred Scott decision was. The cautionary tale they gave was, if they had standing, it would give persons of the Negro race the right to enter every other state whenever they pleased, the full liberty of speech in public and in private upon all subjects upon which its own citizens might speak, and to hold public meetings upon political affairs, and to keep and carry arms wherever they went. So that was what people in the mid-1800s thought about minorities, thought about freedom for all, thought about the Second Amendment. It was used to illustrate a point. So the development of the Second Amendment, the writing of the Second Amendment, the context of the Second Amendment has certainly changed, but the words haven't. That leads to gun control, right? Clint Eastwood, I have a very strict gun control policy. If there's gun around, I want to be in control of it. Clint Eastwood is certainly on one side of the debate. Other people are on the other side of the debate. So gun control started basically around the Prohibition era. You have gangsters, you have Al Capone. They all had access to Tommy guns. They had access to basically anything they wanted, wreaking havoc on the streets. I've been over this before. That started with being illegal to provide Native Americans with guns. And that's where gun control started. But everything has to have a check on it. You have to remember, we're literally only a country because of the citizens' right to own guns. We're literally only a country because we rebelled and because we had this, like, I call it a mutually assured destruction device in our pocket. That's why we're a country. And also worth noting that the Second Amendment typically does not apply to states. You'll learn more about that in the Supreme Court cases and stuff, but no one has applied it to the states. The first major gun control legislation was National Firearms Act of 1934, and I think some other people are going to get more into this. I don't want to talk too much about it, but I think it's worth noting when I talk about the Second Amendment, when I talk about the scope, reaches, all that of the Second Amendment, that this is a limitation of it. So the National Firearms Act of 1934 came about 5 years after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And that was big news, St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago. We all probably have heard of it, right? It's a terrible day. Fake cops raiding someone else, pretending to be cops, line them up against the wall and killed them. Again, historical context is important because 7 people died. 7 men died in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Some of them we've all heard of. 7 guys died. That was a national tragedy, and it certainly was. Last year, 50 died. 50 people died at the Pulse nightclub shooting, and 53 people were shot but not killed. So 103 people shot that day. And I'm sitting here talking to you about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that happened almost 100 years ago, where 7 people died, which again was a tragedy. But it shows a little bit about the political climate now and the political climate then. Now, it did take 5 years for that act to be passed. I wasn't around back then. I can't tell you exactly what the debate was, who voted for it, who voted against it. But 5 years after the St. Valentine's Massacre was the National Firearms Act. That act, what that mainly did was got rid of the ability to own destructive devices and automatic weapons, right? So people then couldn't go into whatever they had before Walmart. Sears, you couldn't go into Sears. Everyone shopped at Sears back then. Couldn't go into Sears and buy a Tommy gun that week, whereas a week before, you probably could have. That's what the National Firearms Act did, and that's why it was passed, because of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Gun control is the curtailing and the limitation of the Second Amendment. Every freedom has some sort of edge where you get into personal rights and the rights on others. I could get up here and say wacky stuff. Someone else could get up here and say wacky stuff. That's freedom of speech. That's terrific. The government cannot limit the freedom of speech. If I get up here and say there's a fire right over there, y'all need to leave, and 3 of you get stampeded to death, that is the limit on free speech. I cannot say that. So every single right that I know of has a limit. It has a fringe and it has an edge, and the battles are fought on those edges. The battles aren't fought over, the battle of free speech is not fought over something you like. Battles of free speech is not fought over pro-government statements. The battle of free speech is fought when neo-Nazis and what's the name of the town in Illinois? Skokie, yeah. The battle of free speech is fought when neo-Nazis want to throw a parade in your town or throw a march in your town. That's where the fringes of freedoms are fought. So, Second Amendment obviously is just like that. Consequences, some would argue, a little more dire. The consequences of expanding the rights of the Second Amendment, people die. No question about it. People die. 50 people at the Pulse nightclub shooting would not have been killed with a .22. 50 people wouldn't have been killed with a musket. 50 people were killed with an AR-15. I'm not here to give you an opinion. Take from that what you will. People say everyone agrees that's sad. Some people say that's sad, but we have that freedom. Some people say that's sad, but let's give up a little bit of that so the guy at least has to reload a couple times. That's the battle on which is fought, and it's just like any other freedom, except with probably more dire consequences, right? And what is the NRA? The NRA is around. They're here. We hear about them all the time. We hear about them on the news. Most of the stuff in that Venn diagram with the InfoWars guys writing articles, they like the NRA. That's fine. The NRA has a purpose and is an advocate. The NRA believes that any regulation on firearms, just about, that is not currently in existence right now, any step that we take will eventually limit and get rid of the Second Amendment. That is the NRA's position. It can at times be an unpopular position. At times I think that they bungle their message a little bit, like after the Sandy Hook shooting, establishing there was a famous tweet that came out by the NRA after the Sandy Hook shooting, and it wasn't them intentionally doing it, but it was something set up, like Hootsuite or something like that. The day of the Sandy Hook shooting, they had an automatically scheduled tweet saying to take your kids to go shooting at the shooting range, and that was an accident. But the NRA can be blustery, and it's not the most popular organization in America right now. Some would argue it has a necessity and it has a purpose because, like I said, you have these rights and you fight the battles on the fringes, and that's certainly where they are. I can't argue that the NRA is not on the fringe sometimes, especially after a national tragedy. And the battles that have already been fought and the limitations that are already in place are here now. Some people can't own guns at the federal level or ammunition, according to 18 U.S. 922 G8. And those people are felons, convicted felons, anyone convicted of a crime that carries more than 1 year. Obviously, fugitives can't own a gun, but they're probably not applying for a gun because they're trying to go undercover. Felons, fugitives, someone deemed incompetent, and in South Carolina and most other states, you do that through probate court. Illegal aliens cannot own guns. Non-citizens cannot buy guns. And people who have renounced their citizenship cannot buy or own or possess a gun. Not sure how they tell that, but that is a fact. Also prohibited at the federal level is a shotgun with a barrel of less than 18 inches. That's considered a sawed-off shotgun because they don't manufacture them, so you would have to have sawed that off. Sawed-off shotguns, a machine gun, or a fully automatic weapon. A lot of people get confused on what exactly automatic means. There's semi-automatic and there's automatic. Automatic means you hold down the trigger and bullets come out until you run out. Semi-automatic is you squeeze the trigger, and each time you squeeze, a bullet flies out without you needing to do anything like bolt or cock or anything like that, or pump. So semi-automatic weapons are certainly legal. Fully autos are not. Any gun with a silencer or a suppressor is illegal. Now, all of these have exceptions. You could go through, I think it's the ATF, get certain permits, but without the permit. Anything with a silencer as a suppressor is illegal. A rifle with a barrel of less than 16 inches, that's illegal. There are arms companies that make guns overseas. There's at least one kind of AK-47 they make overseas that has a barrel of, I think, 14 inches. So they have to put a little extension in the form of a muzzle brake on there. So that, for importing reasons, that is a factor. But anything with a barrel of less than 16 inches that's a rifle is illegal. A destructive device is illegal. Destructive device means an explosive, poison gas, or any gun with a caliber of more than 50. 50 caliber is the highest caliber you can get right now. A gun with no visible serial number, also illegal. And now I've tried a bunch of, like I said, I've tried a lot of cases with guns, and a lot of times they'll get a sled person in there, and a lot of sled experts, or at least one that I've seen a bunch of times, they take classes, and what they do, they restore serial numbers. So you can file off a serial number on a gun, and SLED has ways to get that gun and try to figure out what that serial number originally was. So that's kind of cool. No clue how they do that, but so just because not that you're scratching serial numbers off of weapons, but if you do, They might catch you, and they might know what that serial number was in the first place and trace it back to whatever you're trying to hide it from. And like I said before, a destructive device. Poison gas, grenade, firebomb, Molotov cocktail. Does not, again, exclusion for black powder weapons. It does not include anything black powder, firearms, and any rifle over 50 caliber. That's why a 50 caliber is the biggest you can get. And if you need bigger than that, then I don't know, man. South Carolina laws on guns. There's a few out there. I remember during the Republican primary, Carly Fiorina went on Morning Joe and was talking about how we don't need gun control. And she said that, look, this happens everywhere. South Carolina, there was a church shooting that just happened in South Carolina, talking about Dylann Roof, church shooting that happened in South Carolina, and they have one of the strictest gun control laws in the United States. So gun control doesn't work. And I wasn't even drinking milk, but somehow milk came out my nose and I spit out milk because I was like, what are you talking about? South Carolina does not have anywhere near the strictest gun control laws anywhere near the United States, okay? We do not have strict gun control laws. That was just what we used to call a lie. But here are some of the laws we have. Unlawful carry of a pistol. That is when you carry the pistol anywhere other than, I'm just like walking around with a pistol, that's unlawful carry of a pistol. If I'm waving it around, that's pointing and presenting. I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, carrying a pistol improperly, that a lot of times, probably 7 times out of 10, that is someone carrying it or having it under their car seat. You cannot have a gun under your car seat unless you're a concealed weapons holder. And I think someone else will probably get into more details about the concealed weapons laws, but this is just unlawful carry of a pistol, 0 to 1 year. If you hire a lawyer, usually what I do, I just get you to give up the gun and they dismiss the charge. But hypothetically, 0 to 1 year on unlawful carry of a pistol. Possession of a weapon during a violent crime is an offense in South Carolina. It's also an offense at the federal level under 924C, which will get you automatic consecutive time at the federal level. What do we do in South Carolina? We just say 5 years consecutive or concurrent. It's got to be 5 years. I believe it is suspendable, but it can also be concurrent. When I see that charge, possession of a weapon during a violent crime, and I don't know if any of y'all do criminal offense, I usually just put that on the back burner because that isn't, if you're already charged with a violent crime, the possession of a weapon during it is not of particular importance. That's not what's going to burn you, the possession of a weapon during a violent crime. So that's kind of almost an illusory law. I have never seen anyone get more time because of a possession of a weapon during a violent crime. No one has ever faced more time because of that charge. That's just something, another warrant to sign to make people feel better about gun control in South Carolina. So that's a thing, but not really much of a thing. Anyone else that does criminal defense, you might agree, you might say, hey, my guy got popped for that. That's, we'll talk about that. But I've never seen that charge really hold anything up. Again, South Carolina law, stolen pistol or obliterated serial number, that's 0 to 5 years. That is a felony. And possession of a weapon during a violent crime also is a felony. Again, if you're already charged with the underlying violent crime, that's a felony too. So again, that's not what you worry about. Stolen pistol or obliterated serial number at 0 to 5 year felony. I've represented a few people on that. They always say it's their grandfather's revolver. I don't know why. It's always the grandfather's revolver. So if you got a grandpa and he gives you a revolver, that's great. But just look for that serial number because apparently people's grandpas, I don't know what your grandpas are into, but other people's grandpas are into some shady stuff, hiding from Al Capone and all that stuff. So it's 0 to 5 years, and it's a felony. No one really goes to prison over that I see unless it's part of something else. You know what I mean? Like no one ever just gets caught with an obliterated serial number at a traffic stop and is like, oh, you're facing 5 years, buddy. They're facing it, but they never do it. So that's the South Carolina law on firearms. There's a few more that I forgot to add. Can't even think of what it is right now. The other one I forgot to add, sawed-off shotgun, any kind of illegal weapon. That's also 0 to 5 years. If the state charges that and the feds don't, look over the case because you might find some errors. There might be a reason the feds don't have that, unless your guy just doesn't have a record and was out shooting a 17-inch barreled shotgun in the woods. then maybe the state will take care of it. There was one more. Pointing and presenting. That pointing and presenting a firearm is basically when, like you brandishing a gun. Other states call it brandish. If we're getting in an argument and I'm like, hold a gun and I point it at you, or even if I like take it out to say, what are we going to do? That is pointing and presenting. It's 0 to 5 years. It is a felony. Pointing and firing, it's the same charge. I think that's the weirdest thing in the world. I could like wave the gun at you or shoot it and they charge you with the same thing, although they might, depending on where you shot it, they might go for attempted murder. Pointing and presenting 0 to 5 years. That is always a road rage case, just about. Or an ex-girlfriend, new boyfriend, and old boyfriend show up. There's two scenarios. Road rage or new boyfriend shows up. No, sorry. Road rage or old boyfriend shows up to reconcile when new boyfriend is there. Not to be sexist, I guess the women don't run around with guns like pointing at each other as much as the men do. But it seems like it's always the men that do this. So 0 to 5 years for pointing and presenting. I know of it. Any solicitors here? Any prosecutors? Probably not. You're a prosecutor. That's terrific. Former. Oh, me too. It's okay. I literally know of a solicitor that has been charged with pointing and presenting a firearm. She probably looks like she knows who that is too, and he's a great guy. But he was charged with pointing and presenting, which is a felony. So hey, it can happen to everyone. He was charged with that while he was a solicitor, so that didn't work out. He's a nice guy, though. I don't want to defame him. I am being recorded. Great guy. He went through PTI, which is pretrial intervention, and is now a solicitor again.
Still a solicitor?
He is still a solicitor. Yeah. No, we have some of the toughest gun control laws in the United States. Yes. So I'm being recorded. He's going to find out about this. Great guy. But yeah, it was a road rage, actually. It was in Mount Pleasant on the bridge, which, hey, if it happens on the bridge, it shouldn't even, it's over water or something. People get crazy. It's all right. Not really. But yeah, so pointing and presenting, you see it a lot. And I just think it's the weirdest thing in the world that if I shoot the gun in your direction and if I show it to you, that is the same offense. So I would think that shooting would be, maybe a little extra for shooting, but that is the same offense. At the federal level, I don't do a whole lot of federal work, but I've done a wee bit. The federal level, if you're involved in a violent crime, if you're involved in a violent offense, if you're involved in a robbery and you possess a firearm, that's 5 years consecutive to the underlying offense. So 5 years consecutive to whatever else you would have got if you didn't have the gun. And then if you brandish it, it's 7 years consecutive to the underlying offense. And if you fire it in the air or fire it accidentally, it doesn't really matter. If you fire that gun, or any of your co-conspirators, your friends, your pals that like gave you a ride to the Dollar General that you didn't know that you were robbing, if they fire it, that's 10 years consecutive to the underlying offense. And they're tough on that. It's not like South Carolina with our tough gun control laws. Like if you fire that gun, they will get you. Or they will make you plead to something ridiculous without the enhancement, but it's basically with the enhancement. You know what I mean? They'll take away the enhancement for just to say they did, but you're still facing significantly more time if you have that gun, especially if you shot it. One more thing in South Carolina, this isn't on the slides, but possession of a firearm by a felon in South Carolina, 85% of the time they charge that, you could get rid of it very easily. Because the law in South Carolina is, state level, if you have a gun, if you have a firearm, if you have a weapon, if you have ammunition, whatever, and you've been convicted of a felony, it is legal in the state for you to possess it. The feds can prosecute. It is legal. It has to be a violent felony. So you have to be convicted of something like attempted murder or assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. It is legal for you to own that firearm. Again, the feds can get involved, unless you've been convicted of a violent felony. So many people don't know that. Cops don't know that. Prosecutors are starting to learn that. But has to be a violent felony. Until recently, they changed it about 2 years ago. Until recently, you could have been convicted of a criminal domestic violence and still been able to own the firearm at the state level. I believe they changed that about 2 years ago with the new domestic violence bill. But that's a little scary, I think. People completely able to own guns that have been convicted of things like burglary second, nonviolent. You could go into someone's house during the day if they're not home, steal all their stuff, and then be able to have a gun a few years later, not be charged for it by the state people. Things like, you could beat the crap out of somebody, get charged with assault and battery first degree or second degree, be able to have a gun. So there's really very few restrictions on guns in South Carolina. And again, said it a million times because I don't want to I don't want someone to get arrested that has an old felony and say, well, you told me I wouldn't get arrested. The feds can get involved. It is illegal for a felon to own a gun at the federal level. When I was a solicitor, they told me that they would look out for their guideline was about 3 prior convictions of something moderately serious or 2 prior convictions of something serious. That's just their internal policy on when they would go after someone with a gun. So someone with 1 felony from a while ago with a gun in South Carolina, if the feds didn't pick it up, you're completely scot-free. So that's a little bit interesting. I got a little more time than, I think I started late, so that's, sorry. Wish you could see me talk more, but I think I have a little bit of time. I have a good bit of time. So does anyone have any questions? We have a group chat. It'll be fun. What?
Yeah, I was intrigued with the 1640 case, the Indian gun case where she loaded her gun. Did you find that site? What's the name of the case?
I cannot remember, honestly, and it's probably not too well cited because it was... Yeah. I can't even remember. It was late night one night when I found it, and I thought it was so interesting. And I wish that I don't even have my computer, so I can't look through my history. But
what were you Googling when you found it?
I think I was probably on the section of Massachusetts gun laws. Okay. So yeah, if you want to look that up, help me find it. I'll look for it. But yeah, so the 1640 case, it sounded like it was a low level, maybe like what we call now like a municipal or magistrate case. It wasn't anything too serious. And then she said that her husband died and she was getting rid of her stuff, and she let the Native American have it must have probably been a musket or something like that. It was 1640. Let him have it. And he said, okay. And then, they charged her with that, and she told the judge that, she loaned it to him. So thereby, one of the elements of the offense was not met. So she loaned it to him, and the judge just said, listen, you better get it back right now. That's what I know about the case. I don't have the history, the case site, anything like that. It was probably just, one of those things that's passed along and in some old courthouse somewhere, and
I probably should add, I'm a former federal prosecutor.
Okay.
Caught people for felony possession all the time. There was no 1, 2, 3 felony rules at all. If you had a conviction, you're going down.
Right. Yeah, and I've heard. I'm trying to think when there was a specific era of when they did that. I know that people in federal court were talking about it recently. They were saying about 5 or even as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, they would get people with it.
Through the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, they were talking about that, and there was one specific prosecutor that would always get people for that.
It was nationwide. I wasn't even a prosecutor here.
Okay. No, I mean nationwide, but they were at the place I was at. They were talking about, I remember when so and so was here. This person would fill the jail. Well, that's interesting that you're a federal prosecutor. Once a prosecutor, always a prosecutor. Federal, but every time I'm in federal court, which again I'm not in there too often, probably half. I don't know. Even now, probably half the docket is felon in possession of a handgun or any kind of gun, really. Right. Well, the old, the axiom or whatever is that if there's guns and drugs, the feds will take it. If there's guns and money, the feds will take it. If there's money and guns, the feds will take it. If there's that and the feds don't take it, read your case carefully because you might have something there. I saw recently in federal court someone who risked his life to snitch on a guy that he was in jail with, risked his life, was threatened, just terrible, and he was charged with felon in possession of a firearm. I don't know what kind of firearm it was. I know that the person he snitched on was charged with murder. He's charged with murder. There were some problems with the case with the witnesses. The murder guy pled to voluntary manslaughter and got 15 years. The guy who risked his life, snitched, helped out, and they said, even in the plea, they said he made the case. There wouldn't have been a case but for him. That guy got about 9 years at a nicer facility, but that guy got 9 years. So, one, think about what he would have got if he didn't snitch. He probably would have got more time than the killer. But yeah, the feds they're not fond of people with their felons with guns, and they almost enforce it like kind of an Al Capone type situation. Al Capone, they got him for tax fraud. This guy's just awful, but we'll just get him for tax fraud because that's what we can prove. The feds will do that with their gun laws. They will just find like the leader of a gang, and they're like, "Well, this guy sucks, but it's too hard to like prove that he did such and such and such and such and did all this." He's got a 22 under his car seat though, so let's just lock him up and we'll just do that. So, sometimes I refer to the feds as the fixers because they just kind of fix things their own way.
Deer hunting season. We always just waited for deer hunting season.
Oh wow!
They just couldn't resist. Felons are gonna go get a deer.
And I have a case right now where the guy is a big hunter, and that's how he feeds his family. He's a good guy. He just made a mistake one night, but it's borderline as to whether that's even legal. I don't want to talk too much about it, especially when I'm taped. But he made a mistake one night and did something, but it's borderline as to whether or not he can even be charged with what they charged him with. And the plea offer is a misdemeanor. In South Carolina, a misdemeanor means something we call a misdemeanor. There's really no distinction between a misdemeanor and a felony in South Carolina. They just arbitrarily slap that on random things. You could actually get charged. You could face 10 years in prison for some common law misdemeanors. Perjury, I think, is one. Assault and battery, high and aggravated, used to be one. They codified it in 2010. You can face 10 years in prison for certain misdemeanors in South Carolina. There's certain felonies that only carry, I think, maybe 5 years. So it's an arbitrary term, but the feds consider anything that can carry over 1 year as a felony to them. So this guy that I know is being offered to plead to what would normally be an okay deal, a misdemeanor, but it's going to make sure that he never has a gun again. This guy lives out in the country, feeds his family that way, so I'm not okay with that. So we're working on it. Let me know if you have any tips. But so that's the feds are very serious about felon in possession cases. They use it, they generally just use it to get someone they didn't like beforehand, and it's an easier case to prove. And like I was saying earlier, now they have guidelines as to when they pick the case, when they take the case. It was when I was at the solicitor's office, they told me it was somewhere around, if you see somewhere around 3 moderate level felonies, especially if they involve physical violence or drugs, give the U.S. Attorney's Office a call. Or if you see something real serious, like if he was charged with murder back in like 65 and is out now, and he's carrying around a Glock, then give us a holler. Otherwise, they're not particularly interested. And what the feds do, they're very stringent on the sentencing table, the sentencing guidelines. Your criminal history has a lot to do with that. So they want longer sentences. So if they pick up the case, they already have him in a criminal history category where he'd be facing a lot more time, because that's why they picked it up. Anyone else have any other thoughts or insights? The Second Amendment's terrific. Terrific fun. All right. I think I have, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. I think this is supposed to be over at about, what does it say, 11 or 10:30? Oh, 45 it's supposed to be over? Well, that's just terrific. That's about what time it is. All right, well, thanks so much for having me. Again, no one can ever give a presentation about the Second Amendment with any sort of, any person saying that guy's an idiot. I have 12 guns in my closet right now and I have a survival bunker, or that guy's an idiot. He has a gun. He wants to kill people. That's just the way the Second Amendment is. That's why I'm here talking about it right now. That's why you have this presentation. Well, let's be honest. That's probably why you signed up for the presentation, because there's always differing views on the Second Amendment. Someone's always got something to say that you're going to probably not agree with. You're probably going to hear a lot more about it later. Maybe not. I don't know. So, but that's maybe, along with getting your credits, is probably why you're here. You're here to expand your mind and to learn about things. And I thank y'all for having me and not throwing anything at me.